Yes. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for inviting me here today. Much like Joan said this morning, I feel very privileged to share the day with you. Can I just ask, how many of you are from outside of Oslo? Wow, everybody, that's amazing. Me too. Thank you for letting me use English. My Norwegian is very poor. I've learned how to say thank you, tak, thank you. You'll notice that, Canadians have our sayings. As you see, we have an accent in English. We tend to apologize a lot. I don't know why we do. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I was asked today to talk about how changes are happening to the postgraduate system all over the world. And I'd love to share with you the Canadian experience, as well as I'll share some anecdotes with you from other countries as well. The job that I do, I get to travel and have conversations like this. And I hope this will be a conversation. I will share a few things with you that address the questions that came up already today. Why should we change? What exactly should we teach? How can we possibly do that when we are so busy and so resource strapped? And how would we know that it's working? All those kinds of questions. And how will we pay for it? Those are all valid questions that we've been struggling with too, and I'll share those stories with you. This morning, my colleague Joan asked how many trainees were in the audience. I didn't get to see how many hands. So residents, if you're here, a few of you, fantastic. I like that you put your hands up so high, you're proud, that's good. How many of you are frontline clinicians? You see patients. Most people. How many of you would say that you have a responsibility for part of the training system? Okay, majority. Okay, all right. How many people are here just for the food? There's two, okay, good, it's fair. Feel free to take a picture of any of my slides, please do. And if you want to put it on social media, that's good, that makes a worldwide conversation. There's my Twitter handle, you can add it. Much like Joan, I feel like Canadians and Norwegians have a lot in common. Not so much the polar bears, but we have a northern climate. When I landed here, the forest smelled just like Canada. It was a little bit warmer than Ottawa. Ottawa is a very cold capital. And lots of wonderful, friendly people. And our systems are very similar. We're a little bit better at hockey, but we're humble about it. This is what Ottawa looks like right now. It's pretty, the colors are changing and so on. And in about 3 months, it'll get very cold. It goes down to -40 in Ottawa, and it goes as high as +40. It gets very hot. And this is what our canal looks like when it freezes over in February. The government workers skate to work down the canal and go downtown to the parliament buildings and the government buildings. And we have, a good year when the canal really freezes over, we get 1 million tourists, especially from China. And they come and try and skate for the first time on our bumpy canal. It looks like this. And my trainees in emergency medicine love it because people fall and they break bones and they get to practice. They call it Fracture Fest. Have you already heard about me? I started working in medical education while I was a medical student. I was inspired by my role models to help make the system better. That was fascinating, and I went off and did a graduate degree. I had to pay for it, so I needed to get a job. And my job was at this building called the Royal College we have in Canada. And the project I was doing was CanMeds. And that was the first major project in med ed that I did. And it was part of my master's thesis. Since then, I've been working continuously in this area. And competency-based is an approach I've been working on for more than 20 years. I'm a slow learner, but I'm getting there. I'd like to talk about how all this change is happening around the world. And I'd like to set it up for you just to give you a bit of a historical context. I'll talk about the Canadian system. I think in that system you'll hear yourself. It's very similar. And I'll talk about the changes we're making, because some of them are quite significant. Here's my challenge for you. While you're listening, I would love for you to grab something that you say, oh yeah, I could do that right now in my setting, and maybe the things that you could not do because it's too hard, the context is different. And I'd love to hear those shouted back at the end, if you could tell me. The system we have now in the postgraduate space owes a lot to these old white men. They're Americans. Who knows who they are? Flexner on the left, and Sir William Osler? No? He's Canadian, actually, and went to the US. So Flexner was a non-physician, did a major report for the Carnegie Foundation, and basically said that medical education should be scientific and systematic, and they closed 1/3 of all the North American medical schools. And the template that he made in 1910, we still use. Your medical schools, my medical schools are based on it. Osler was one of the founders of our postgraduate system as we know it today. In fact, if Osler walked into your residency program, Osler would recognize all of the setup, except he would say, where are the teachers? Because the teachers are busy doing their own patients. In his day, they were together all day long. In fact, that's where the word resident comes from, right? You remember this? They were resident because they lived in the hospital. In fact, it was kind of verboten to get married because you really shouldn't have a family. You're going to miss some of the good cases. That was sort of the era. There's a paper by Frank, no relation, in the Lancet, and it talks just about this big idea. If you take a long view of how medical training works around the world, this is an important paper in the Lancet. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. And one of the tables in the Lancet is here. It says that we kind of come through a few stages of development. And over 100 years ago, it was a pure apprenticeship, a master clinician with a trainee, and they pretty much lived and breathed the same space, seeing all the patients together, until the master clinician said, you're probably good enough to go down the street and start your own practice. And then we started putting structure on things, so there's less differences in the graduates. And so we had, we had writings about the character of trainees, and we had objectives. And then we entered the psychometric era, where we hired PhDs to analyze all of these tests we were giving, especially in North America. There's a lot of tests. And you were competent when you had good validity, reliability, and high scores on a test. That was competence. We're leaving that era. In fact, we've left it over 10 years ago. And now we're in the era of authentic, workplace-based assessment and a competency-based era. And I'll talk more about that today. In Canada, we have, like I say, many similar features in our system. We have medical schools like you. We have only 17. But the 17, some of them are very large, and they really are 3 or 4 medical schools with multiple sites. Our population is about 40 million now, plus or minus, Canadians. We used to have a period after medical school. So by the way, you don't enter from high school in Canada. It's a graduate degree to get in medical school. Most people do 2 degrees before they get in, so a little bit older. And we used to have a period immediately afterwards that we called the internships. And you still have a period like that, the sort of foundational training, very common, Australia, the UK, and so on. We got rid of that. We sunsetted it in 1990. And it was partly an educational design to make people streamline quicker into their specialty. And partly it saved a lot of money for the government, saved a lot of money in salaries. And trainees loved it because they went quickly into their specialty. They graduated sooner. They had more of an income sooner in their permanent job. But some people to this day regret the loss of, with nostalgia, of being able to rotate through all of these specialties that maybe you won't see ever again. We have a system of specialties and subspecialties. So you must do a specialty first if you want to do a subspecialty. We have about 29 specialties. And if you add the specialties and subspecialties together, we have 68 disciplines that we recognize. On top of that, you can do a diploma or a fellowship, and then you get into 96 disciplines that our system recognizes. It's a partnership, our system, in that the place where I work, the Royal College, oversees the system. We act under an act of parliament, so it's a federal law. And when we write regulations, it's equivalent to having an act of law or regulation of law across the country. But we do that in partnership with provincial medical schools, provincial governments, and dollars flow on a provincial basis, and regulation is on a federal basis. It's an interesting combination. Government is very hands-off in our system, unlike some other countries, so that the doctors have to set their own standards. The doctors decide which specialties are organized, but government has influence on how many positions are available, how many they will fund on a given basis, and that varies from year to year. So we've gone through the same evolution. In Canada, 100 years ago, you would see Sir William Osler sitting at the bedside with a patient and an apprentice, and that was our medical education system. My college was founded in 1929, and medical education had already been running for 100 years or so in Canada. We're a young country. And then over time, we had our medical schools involved in around 1970. And now we have this partnership that is going on in the system. And one of the bonuses is we get the best of the university environment. We also get resources flowing from the education budget and from the healthcare budget, which is a bonus. There is, of course, the downside of having lots of stakeholders and lots of different bureaucracies to deal with. And we've entered this competency-based era. So this is the Royal College on a sunny day. It's literally an ivory tower. It used to be a nunnery, a home for an order of nuns. They were dying out, so they moved out, and we moved in. And it's a beautiful building. If you ever come to Ottawa, come visit. We'll give you a tour. Like I say, this building recognizes 96 disciplines. It oversees the accreditation of the postgraduate, the continuing professional development system. Canada has SIM centers. We also accredit those. We also accredit diploma programs, and we do international accreditation now, so 5 kinds. We set curriculum. We oversee assessment. We run high-stakes exams. We certify people, so it's a busy building. It's got hundreds of employees and takes the role of in other countries, what would be separate institutions. You may be familiar with this. This is our CanMeds work. This is one of the first projects I was involved in. And the college embarked on this because we were concerned that medical education was too focused on medical expert, when we had very good evidence in the 90s that other competencies were necessary to provide excellent patient care. This may be obvious to you, but you need to have good communication skills like we talked about this morning in order to give great patient care. Sometimes, actually, our therapy is our voice and not our hands or our scalpel. Furthermore, we knew that physicians were increasingly working in teams. This is around 1990. Now it's exclusively in teams. There's almost no solo practitioners anymore in Canada. So we needed to make sure doctors were prepared for that, prepared to be stewards of resources and so on. We wrote it as 7 domains, and we did a very systematic approach trying to assemble it. Lots of consultation, took us almost a decade. We asked patients in focus groups what they wanted from doctors, and that was really powerful. The concept of health advocate, that came from patients. When we first launched CanMeds, I got letters saying, yesterday I was medical expert and today I'm 1/7 a medical expert. And then they added some swear words at the bottom. And I had to explain, no, medical expert brings it all together. That's why we drew the diagram. Our clinical training looks just like yours. People are working side by side, as well as over time, our faculty are getting busier and busier. So our teachers now have their own clinical load booked in parallel with their trainees, and the number of interactions is declining. I'm not sure if that resonates with you here, but it is a challenge over time. It's a threat to our supervision. Nevertheless, we have some wonderful teachers just like you do. Maybe a subtle difference is our teachers are cross-appointed not only to their hospital, but also to the university. So we use some of that as incentives for good educational behavior. We require every medical school in our accreditation system to support a faculty development system at every site for all of the teachers. If they don't do that, they can't have trainees. Our accreditation system has teeth. It's an English expression for if you fail accreditation, we take the trainees away. We have that authority. So it's high stakes. If you put all this together, if you ask a Canadian doctor, they all feel that we're doing something really right. We're very proud of our medical education, and you probably are too, and your colleagues on the front line might be as well. However, over the last few years, as part of our job, our stewardship job of keeping up with the best practice, evidence has come forward which made us question that. So on the horizon, we actually recognize that there are some major challenges. So I wonder if you have heard of the case of this young boy, Jack Adcock. Anybody know that story? You might know it by another name, Bawa Garba. Anybody know that story? A couple people are nodding. One hand's up. I'm going to tell you very briefly this story because I think it illustrates a challenge to supervision in the 21st century. Dr. Bawa Garba is a pediatrician. She was a trainee a couple of years ago, and she had just come back from a maternity leave where she had her latest child. She has multiple kids. And on her first day back in the National Health Service in the UK, she was assigned to a hospital she had never been to before. On her first day back, she walked in the building, was handed the code pager, and she was on call. She hadn't been at work, hadn't seen a patient for a year. Not only was she on call, but the other two senior registrars were not present. They were actually absent for a variety of reasons. So she was the only senior resident in that pediatric hospital. Her supervisor was available by phone. Oh, but he was in another city that day. That day there's a lot of really sick kids. But midway through the day, she was paged to a bedside where a child was, there was an active resuscitation underway. She attended that bedside, started helping with the resuscitation. A nurse came in and said, stop, 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 this child is do not resuscitate. So they ceased efforts, and that was a really heavy day, and she let her supervisor know. And amongst her many patients she saw was a young boy named Jack who had pneumonia. In fact, he had sepsis. He was sick, but he was improving, and she gave him some fluids and antibiotics. She ordered some labs, but the lab's computer was down and not reporting that day. Late in the wee hours, she finally got to bed, and then she got paged for another child resuscitation. So she rushed to the bedside and started resuscitation. And then once again, a nurse came in, a different nurse, and said, this is a DNR child, because it was the same bed as the one earlier in the afternoon. So they stopped resuscitation, and 10 minutes later, they realized their error, that DNR order was the earlier child's order. So just a series of patient safety issues. Nevertheless, she continued the resuscitation. The child died. She was charged with murder in the UK and struck off the GMC register and lost her job. There was a whole series of appeals back and forth, and eventually she was exonerated. Along the way, though, the profession got very angry at the regulator because the regulator initiated the action. And one of the things they used to prosecute her was her reflections in her diary, because she was required by her program to write reflections on every event that was a critical incident. And she talked about the things she could do better, which the prosecutor read in court as proof of her incompetence. The supervisor was never questioned, was never penalized, and had no consequences, and was not involved. I think we can do better, and there's evidence to this effect. I hope this story resonates with you. And the evidence is huge. In fact, it goes back 100 years. So for 100 years, we've been writing these reports that say we should teach more than medical expert, and we should actually look and see if people are doing it. That's the gist of these papers. This is a systematic review. It's in JAMA. It's over 20 years old, but it summarizes 100 years of reports. If you look at all of this literature, there's a number of themes in the literature about the things we should be doing better in our system. We know better. We have evidence that we should be doing better. We know that we should be supervising better, our assessment system should be tuned, we should be teaching more than medical expert, and so on. I'm going to give you a couple of those talking points right now, and then I'll tell you about our system. You may have encountered this if you're a trainee. You meet a supervisor who turns to you and says, I can't believe you can't do that yet. And if you've been a supervisor, you've encountered the trainee where you say, I can't believe they can't do that yet. And that's because we all have a different mental model about what people should be doing at different times. People go through different experiences at different rates, and sometimes our system is a bit ad hoc. It's a bit what you've seen. It's kind of experiential, so you can't guarantee that everybody gets the same experience. If you interview clinical teachers, if I ask the people in the room, if we did a focus group, and if you look at all the world's literature, you get some of these themes that teachers feel really, really time pressured. They have trouble getting time to actually directly observe. Giving feedback is painful. In fact, it's kind of cringy. You feel kind of uncomfortable. I know that teachers in Canada tell me that when they have to give feedback, they know, because they had taken all the workshops at the Canadian medical schools, but they know they have to give feedback, and so they turn to each other and they say things like, it was a pleasure to work with you. You should read more. Thanks for coming out. Read more should be translated in every language. It should be on every form. In fact, sometimes they find the assessment system kind of useless. The forms are long and they feel like administrative forms. Nevertheless, if you poll teachers, almost all of them would say that they had a concern of at least some of their graduates should not have gone on to practice, that they wouldn't bring their own family to those graduates. If you look at the assessment system, you have a lot of this, useless comments, pleasant, read more, because we're uncomfortable with those scenarios. And you get this phenomenon of people doing a pen down a page in a column on an assessment score, or nowadays they're just clicking down a column. Have you seen this? Oh, maybe not. A few of you have. So in other words, everybody's a 4, right? And so this gives you hawks and doves. A lot of groups of doctors, you have about 95% doves. They've skewed all their scores to the right, and a few hawks that use the whole scale in whatever assessment scenario there is around the world. This is universal. This is my colleague Nancy Dudek. She does research on what we write underneath versus the score and finds a mismatch often. Though sometimes the comments are kind of cryptic. Like you have to read between the lines and be a doctor to know that it's a problem. A lawyer might miss it. For example, I was involved in an appeal and we were handed a package as there was evidence for why this trainee should fail. And there was cryptic comments like, when you find a patient that's not breathing, don't forget the ABCs. That's a big red flag for me. The person got a 5. We have little evidence that we have very little time to do direct observation. This is in every country it's ever been looked at. And Eric Combo is one of the champions for that. We have trouble with our assessment systems getting enough data to hold people back when they need help. They need to do better. And we have trouble using our current assessment systems to actually help people learn. We kind of have this search and destroy approach to assessment right now. For trainees, assessment can feel really cringy. The system sometimes feels, you saw the quotes this morning, sometimes feels useless, like the comments aren't really helping me, or that doctor never saw me, how could they possibly fill out the form, so I'm not listening. And one of the worst ones, a phenomenon that trainees tell me is at the end of some rotation or at the end of a day, and they have to go and talk to the teacher to get their feedback, and they're expected to, tell the teacher some feedback in some way. But the power differential is so big, it's really awkward. It's like, wow, today was amazing. You're a great teacher. Very robotic. Yeah. And then the biggest evidence that I think has changed our thinking is that we have very good evidence that if you have a time standardized system, your graduates will graduate with variable ability. It's just the way our brain works. It's also about what experiences they've had and how ad hoc their training is. And that's dangerous. That can harm patients. This is an example of a graph from Barsuk. And Barsuk's group does all of these clever research papers on mastery learning. And it's really clear from these controlled trials that they run that the average person, there's no such thing as an average person. We all learn at different rates. And that a mastery learning approach means people get multiple kicks at learning something until they master it. They've shown that a mastery curriculum improves patient outcomes, fewer infections, and saves money. So our current healthcare outcomes actually have some evidence that we need to do better. I was going to remind you about those. This is a graph from my country. It's from Ontario, and it's from cardiology, but it could be from any country and any specialty outcome. What you see is this pattern of huge variability. This graph happens to be Canadian Ontario hospitals, and it's all of the patients taken to the cath lab for an angiography, right? So they're injecting some dye into their heart to look at their coronaries to see if they're blocked. This is the percentage of patients with clean coronaries. They found no blockage. It's an invasive procedure. You have to make the right choice about which patient goes to the cath lab. So in one hospital, it's 24%. In another hospital, it's 3/4 of the patients have clean coronaries. When patients and governments look at graphs like this, and there's one in every specialty in the room has graphs like this, they wonder what we're doing as stewards of the med ed system. What are you doing for these graduates? They're so variable. So let me tell you about this guy. This is David Ash. He's my current favorite health services researcher. And David Ash collects these giant databases on doctors and looks at the patterns in them. And so David Ash asked, is there any variation in complication rates amongst American obstetricians? Huge database, very, very large, over 10 years of data per every obstetrician. And he looked at their complication rates. The variation was 30% between the top and the bottom, which I think most of the public would argue is unacceptable. It's a huge variation. And when he tried to dig into it and say, is this related to exam scores? Is this related to, what state you were born in? Is this related to patient factors? He was able to control for all of that, and it washes out. What predicts an obstetrician's complication rate is their teacher's complication rate. So it's the post-grad training that sets people up for their practice and their complication rate. And then the even more challenging thing is, it's permanent. Every year in practice, obstetricians got better and their complication rates went down, but they never caught the group that started a quintile above them. So even though we learn in practice, setting you up in postgrad is really important. So this is an impetus for us to do better. Some people in the public think we have a T-steeping model where we just put a trainee in the program for a while and they come out a doctor, and that's probably not good enough. So here's the challenges with current training. Just to put it in, this is your money slide. We have variable graduates. Time does not equal achievement. Our teachers are really, really busy. They're assigned work in parallel. So they're getting too busy to teach or observe our trainees. We have evidence that trainees are unprepared for stages of their career. We have evidence that our assessment system, as we used in the 20th century, was suboptimal. And we actually don't hold people back when they need it to help them get better. And we have concerns about patient harm as a result. We have some evidence of missing content like communication skills from curricula. And we just know that there's a bunch of best practices we haven't incorporated. It's kind of silly if you really look into it. So Einstein would say that's silly, you should actually address these things. Doing the same thing over and over just leads to the same results. Okay, so change is underway, and you've heard about it quite a bit today, and people have been asking about it, asking the same questions. And so the change ahead that we're adopting is competency-based approaches. I realize that change is not happy for everybody, that your world is filled with change, you're under pressure to see lots of patients, and money doesn't grow on trees. Nevertheless, we have this rationale that there's some things that we can do. And CBME has been the recommended approach for decades, and I'll show you evidence to that effect. So we chose competency-based approaches as a way of upgrading our PGME system. So we're in the CBME era. This is the logo of our ICBME collaborators. It's a group of 70 researchers from around the world. We're all trying to just advance medical education using these techniques. And we have a website called gocbme.org. CBME is just an approach that really focuses on the graduate abilities at the end of their training. And everything else is underneath that. So abilities are king. This was recommended by the World Health Organization in 1978. So we're just catching up now. Competency-based education says, what are the abilities needed of graduates, and work backwards. And that's how the system is entirely organized. So what are the abilities needed of graduates? How can we sequence them from novice to expert? How can we make that teacher-trainee interaction as good as possible, given our scenario? What learning activities are really needed? So it's pretty utilitarian. And how can we use best practices in assessment? Those are the 5 characteristics of CBME. How do you know if you have a CBME curriculum? You have an answer to all 5 questions. There are lots of programs around the world that have answered one of them, and that's fine. That's still an enhanced program, but you need all 5 to be a CBME program. CBME has an underlying philosophy of the growth mindset. How many of you have heard of the growth mindset? I may have some other name here. A few of you have. The idea is, this is what Joan showed this morning, that our trainees move across in an arc. That's just how our human brain operates. If you are a skier in this room, and there are probably many, you weren't instantly an Olympic level skier. You started somewhere and you got better over time. And that same is true of in medicine and other health professions. The growth mindset is that failure is an opportunity to improve, that we're always improving, we're always striving for better. We're not born perfect. And in fact, feedback that helps us improve an aspect of practice is welcome and should be sought out. Elite athletes do this all the time. Elite musicians do this all the time. In medicine, we have this strange culture of, if I don't get an A, it must be horrible. So maybe I just won't ask, right? I'm going to move on a little bit. This is meant to make a better system. So let me introduce you to the toolkit, and then I'll finish with how the Canadian system works. I'm okay for time for a bit? Yeah, okay, good.
7 minutes.
Great. So some of you are familiar with these words, but I want to introduce them to you. I am using English, so there might be a Norwegian translation, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page for our conversation. So first of all, you've heard the word competency a lot today. Even I heard that through the Norwegian. I recognize competency. We use the CanMEDS framework with its 7 domains. You can't graduate in Canada unless you demonstrate competence in every domain. We require it. So you could be the world's most technically proficient proceduralist, but if you have no communication skills, you will not pass. You have to have a minimum standard in all. We have to make sure that they're observable at the end and that they're aligned with societal needs, which is the tricky part. CBME says that you have to sequence those competencies in a way that you can actually see a novice go to an intermediate and go towards expert, and that takes a bit of thinking and a bit of work. Just writing the exit competencies is great, but it's difficult for people on the ground to actually see how they can get people there. So we wrote them as milestones. This is the next piece of jargon. First competency, then milestone. A milestone, in our parlance, is just you take a competency and then you write sub-statements that are sequenced from novice to expert. So it doesn't matter what the competency is, whether it's procedure or whether it's breaking bad news, you can write smaller statements that make it go from novice to expert. And it allows you to sequence curriculum. The third jargon word is an EPA. How many of you have heard of EPAs? A few of you. So it stands for Entrustable Professional Activity, and it's just work. It's a task of your specialty. And it was independently invented by both Alla ten Kat in the Netherlands and a guy named Eric Warm in the US about 15 years ago. And they've been working on it ever since. And it's kind of magic if you use EPAs in a curriculum. I'll show you why. So the concept in EPAs is entrustment, which is a made-up word. It's not the same as trust, but it's this idea of what can I delegate to this person and leave the room and they'll be safe to do it. And when you look at somebody and they're working, you're making quick entrustment decisions all day long. But if you're not looking at them, then you're assuming entrustment. This is the concept that we borrowed for the curriculum. The third element is that all of the learning or the rotations and the placements, they all need to be sequenced in a way that help people go from novice to expert. The fourth ingredient is that we change the bedside to really help teachers focus on observing some behavior and coaching to helping them better. What do we mean by that? We're emphasizing direct observation and coaching. So you heard about feedback quite a bit today, and you heard about coaching a little bit today. We've really emphasized the word coaching in English because we're trying to emphasize that feedback is not just delivering information. It's what Joan described in R2C2, that they're trying to actually take the information and use that assessment for learning and help person enhance what they're doing. In our studies in Canada, if you ask doctors about what it's like getting feedback and their experience in training, they all talk about how hard it is and how kind of uncomfortable and how useless. And you ask those same doctors if they were involved in sports or music, and they say, of course my teacher gives us feedback. If they didn't, they would be a terrible coach or a terrible music teacher. And they're really specific and they help me get better. It's such a disconnect. It's something in medicine we've created in our culture that we need to overcome. So we use the word coaching to separate it from our 20th century experience of feedback. And coaching is meant to be really useful statements that make someone better. So this is the paradigm shift. Instead of assessment of learning, that's the search and destroy system that tries to find the trainee that doesn't belong. It's assessment for learning. We have lots and lots of low stakes observations, and we roll them up into a decision about progress. I'll give you my slides at the end, those of you who are taking pictures. We had to teach our faculty to do this, so we created a coaching model. This is part of our workshop slide. So part of our coaching model is coaching in the moment, which is right now at the bedside, what I just saw you do, and coaching over time, which is thinking about all of the experiences you've had over the last few months. Let's talk about your progress. Those are different, and you need to train faculty differently for both. The facilitation skills are the same, but one requires very quick rapport. This one requires longitudinal view. This is our workshop slide for when we teach doctors to coach in the moment. We teach them RxOCD because they remember it. This is exactly the same as R2C2, by the way. It's the same elements that Jones invented. The R is for rapport. You have to have rapport in order to give feedback. There's one program that tried to implement our new system, and they had doctors parachuting in to do observations, but they were poorly received because they had no rapport with the trainee. Whoa. So RxOCD. The X is for setting expectations. So you need, in this workshop, we tell doctors that they need to set expectations with trainees, that they're going to give feedback, that they're going to give them coaching feedback, and they're going to be observing them. Thank you. The O is for observe. The C is for coach, which is the thing they're supposed to do after observing. And the D is for document. As Joan said, if you don't write it down, it can't be assembled into a bigger picture of the trainee. To roll it up, we call that programmatic assessment. And this involves having lots and lots of low-stakes observations by many different people in many different ways in authentic settings, and having a competence committee that puts it all together. So the literature on this, the big authors are Lambert Schuwerth and Kees van der Vleuten. It's a whole series of papers about it. It actually gives us confidence in it. The idea is you sample lots and lots of different ways, and this is one of the secrets why it worked in Canada. Instead of having an assessment that takes 30 minutes or an hour, it's lots and lots of little 2 to 5 minute assessments that I document, that I do coaching for, and I move on. It allows me to still have my clinical day. I still see the same number of patients, and I still do one of these every time I work with a trainee. We did this. This is another ingredient that enabled this to be possible. All the scores that we use around the world, all the anchors, they tend to have poor reliability, and people don't know how to use them. They tend to be skewed to the right. The O score is a validated scale for entrustment, and it turns the question around and says to the faculty, what was your role in what you saw today? It turns out that doubles the reliability of the form. So you ask faculty, if you saw the trainee do something, what was your role? Did you jump in and take over, or you really didn't need to be there? And so we use this score exclusively at the Royal College. This is what we recommend every site be using. If you get scores on all of those little observations, if you get many of them, you start to enter the world of data analytics, and you can actually predict how people are doing. Using the whole scale is good, so you have to orient everybody that they will be using the 1s and 2s, they're not just ornamental, that they need to move from left to right over the course of time. And in fact, the slope of the curve is the biggest predictor of your trainee's performance, not what the spot number was today. It's the slope of the curve. So you need lots of different samples. In the world of learning analytics, you start to see this. This is what my program looked like this summer. My emergency medicine program rolled out the new curriculum, and 9 out of the 10 trainees were on this slope. It was a beautiful thing to see. They started off here with their EPAs, and they all moved up over 2 months. But at 2 months, we found this person who was flatlining. And it turns out this person has a very different background, and we needed to do some modified curriculum for him. He needed some extra time just learning some basic skills. You need a competence committee that meets to roll things up, and that gets rid of some of that subjectivity of individual supervisors, and the system works. Okay, so a couple of anecdotes, and then I'll finish up. This is all over the world. This is in Saudi Arabia, this is in Kuwait, this is in Vietnam, this is in Australia, in various ways. And we started to assemble the initial outcomes. The early outcomes say that this is possible. In every system, you need to figure out some ways of doing it that manage time and resource. Trainees get greater satisfaction because they have so much feedback, useful coaching feedback. Faculty have greater confidence in trainees as they move through because major things have been looked at as they go through. So you can delegate more things to the senior trainees who have gone through a program like this. You get more defensible decision making. In countries where learners appeal a decision that they thought the mark was too low, you have lots of data to have conversations about, and those appeals go away. And we have early data that says patient outcomes are better. We also have lessons from pilots that failed, and here's some of the feedback I have for you. So if you only change the assessment system, it'll prolong training because you'll find all the things that your trainees don't know. So you need a curriculum as well as an assessment system. If you don't have a digital portfolio to load things into, it's going to be very heavy. If you do this in paper, it'll be very hard to get all the observations that you need and to collate them. It becomes very expensive. Faculty need orientation because entrustment is kind of a different framing. They need skills around coaching because the feedback they got in training was very different. You can still game this system. You can still do checklists. One of the biggest complaints about the UK system when they did, quote, CBME, I don't think it's CBME, but when they rolled out their system, is that they had a checklist culture. People just check things off. I think there's an editorial, I think it's in the BMJ, and it's from a urologist who said he had a knock at his door, and he had a young trainee who said, Hi, doctor, you don't know me, but I need to examine a scrotum. And because it's on our checklist. Oh, one other thing I want to mention is that trainees in a new curriculum that is this changed, they will feel anxious, so you need to support them through. What we learned in Canada when we rolled this out is that it depends where you start. Each site had different issues, and we needed to support them all differently. We needed to upskill our faculty, because many of them had a different experience, and we needed to learn from all the curricula all over the world. So let me finish with what we did in Canada. Here's how we applied it to our real world, which looked just like yours up until recently. So our new Canadian system is called Competence by Design. That's the marketing name of it. It's just a new curriculum. We made a new version of CanMeds. It's our 3rd edition. It is free in English, it's free in Spanish, and it's free in Arabic on our website. We also wrote milestones, so those little small statements for all of our competencies across multiple stages of expertise. So you can get little statements that are already written in English and in French. And that is also free. You can go to the website, there's a little software wizard. You just type in the stages you want, it'll spit them out. We not only incorporated new CanMeds, but we got rid of postgraduate years and replaced it with stages. More about that in a minute. We filled each stage with EPAs and milestones. You must demonstrate achievement of each stage before you move on. And we made a new assessment and new accreditation system. So here's the stages of training. So you leave medical school, and your first stage is called transition to discipline. Your second is foundations. The biggest one is core, and we moved our exam back to the end of core to allow for a transition to practice stage. And only then will we give certification to trainees. We think of milestones as the enablers of EPAs, so all the ingredients, the things you need to be able to do. And EPAs are kind of like the big representations of a specialty. So we ask every specialty to write their own EPAs. We assign an educator and a professional technical writer with them to make it easier, which is a big investment. So all these stages are made up of milestones. You have to be observed on all of them. You have to have evidence of achievement before you can move on. And here's an example of how we applied that to emergency medicine. And the time allocated is a resource to each trainee. Some trainees need more time. We use the electives for them to go back and pick up things that they didn't get enough on. All right, here's an example of an EPA. It may be hard to read at the back. It's from transition to discipline, right out of med school. Recognize an unstably critically ill patient, mobilize the team and the supervisor, initiate basic life support. If they don't see it in the emerge department, we do it in the SIM center. And they just have to have multiple observations of this. We use the O score, and we actually get to see the whole scale used. It's amazing. For the first time ever, because all of our other scores, they're all columns. But this one, we get to see people moving through all the scores. And the more observations we have, the clearer the picture is of the trainee. This is what our e-portfolio looks like. We provided it free for every program. And there's a little bit of gamification. I heard that earlier today. There's gamification because the trainees want to see themselves moving from left to right. They want to get lots of observations. If you're an observer, which is our faculty are called, you get this popping into your inbox. It's really quick. It takes about 90 seconds to fill out. If you are a program director or a site director, you can see every trainee's progress. And what we're working on is benchmarking that nationally. The learning curves I told you play out in our programs. And we have competence committees at every site to look at all the trainees. All right, so we talked about why we're thinking about changing our system. And we looked at some of that evidence. We're criticized in medicine of having this T-steeping model. We're criticized in medicine for having too much variability, an unacceptable amount. And people like David Ash have found that there's actually a 30% difference in our complications outcomes of our graduates. Einstein would say that that is something we need to address. It's time to change. So we chose CBME as a better way to train health professionals. Now it's your turn to think about the things that you could actually use from this talk and the things that wouldn't make sense, and you have to invent your local solution. That's what all of us are doing. It takes courage and it takes effort, but doesn't necessarily take a lot of money, not necessarily. CBME is a journey. I just want to finish with one thing. This will help you understand all Canadians and why they talk the way they do. Can you just click on the video for me? There you have it. Canadians being born. Thank you very much.